a large language models and hallucination, not great with numbers yet. I think we've all in the past years at some point had an experience trying to get ChatGPT. One that comes to mind is count orange strawberries. That made a lot of podcasts for that example. It will continue to get influenced though, and AI will be used through more and more things. So continue to know where your data is coming from, because it's one thing if you're feeding into a model and saying, here's a call transcript, create me a blog post on it. It's a very, very different thing if you're feeding a model a spreadsheet and saying, here's the numbers I get, what should I be forecasting? You still really need to know each of those numbers and each of where each of them came through in a way that is just less applicable for remembering each quote. So I'd caution people on over reliance on AI for numbers.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing Podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. Most of my days and weeks are spent running Did It, a full-service marketing agency that used to be a SaaS platform. And so I've lived in both the SaaS and agency worlds. I also run a brand, Truth Nutrition, a nonprofit called Giving Forward, and various other ventures, including an incubator called Various Ventures. Super excited to be chatting with Janet Gehrmann today, who started Scoop Analytics. And the analytics world is in constant flux. And so clearly there was something that was the catalyst for you deciding, okay, there's nothing out there that's meeting all the needs, and I have to start a company, which is sort of the typical entrepreneurial journey. So why don't we start with what was the catalyst and what was the startup journey that you had?
So my co-founders and I all met at Burst, which was one of the first BI analytics tools in the cloud. And one of the things we noticed was that there's a lot of really solid, strong analytics tools at the top end of the market, but there's not a BI tool that somebody in revenue or marketing operations can just say, I have these 5 data sources. I want to integrate them together all in one dashboard, and I want to combine them together. And I don't want to have to go back for a master's degree in data science and combinatorics to do it. So really what we were looking to develop is the first BI tool on the market that was designed with just a business operations person in mind.
Great. Well, yeah, certainly not everyone wants to have to learn how to do the deep dives in statistics and analytics themselves. So one of the other things that happened probably during your journey was one of the previous sort of North Stars in the analytics space was the Google Analytics, and they went obviously to GA4 from Universal Analytics, and it was already starting to suck before, and then a lot of people would say, well, it sucks more now. And so that may or may not be true, but the reality is that I'm curious whether that change was also a catalyst. Like, did it change the way you were going to market? Did it change what people were asking for? Because a lot of them were losing the kind of dashboards that they were used to and trying to figure out, should I rebuild the kind of, visualizations that I had in GA4, or should I move to something more comprehensive?
Need a step back, even in addition to that GA4 migration, Google has been purchased Looker a few years back, and now it's even more deeply integrated. So those two twin forces have been really going in tandem. And I do think that there is a certain flavor to analytics and a certain trend where about 2 decades ago, we saw very large business intelligence companies, the MicroStrategies of the world, which before they got famous for Bitcoin, they were a business intelligence company, the Oracles, and they were great. But then business users realized, hey, I need something that I can interact with, a dashboard I can change. That's where we got the Tableaus, Lookers, and Power BIs. Now people are realizing, I have that. That's a great dashboard, but now I can't get at the rest of the data. So in this transition, partly it's exacerbated by that switch to GA4, which I think brave on Google to do it and how they did it. They gave a lot of legacy time, but I still know many people who struggled with it. It wasn't so much that as the catalyst for rebuilding, because from a lot of marketers I know, they were mostly just how do I keep the lights on and keep my data in the same format? It did. I know a lot of people who started to use more things like data warehouses just to get the data as a catch-all. And now they're struggling of, okay, my data's in the data warehouse, but I can't get to the data warehouse. IT owns that. And now how do I report on that? So we're seeing a lot of trends like that in the market. And it depends a little bit on company size. If you're a Fortune 100, you've got dozens of different data warehouses in place. If you're a startup under 1,000 people, so I know San Francisco has many definitions of the word startup. So I'll just say if you're a company really under 1,000, it's probably not getting in the centralized data warehouse. So how do you then use it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, data warehouses, more than one data warehouse means potentially more than one set of information coming out of that data warehouse. And obviously, in analytics, bad data in results in bad insights and bad suggestions out. Yet marketers throw around the term all the time, like, I need a single source of truth. Like, I need to be able to go to one place and sort of find the answer. And a lot of them sort of treat analytics like they would accounting documents, which are like census level data. Okay, it needs to balance. It's a balance sheet, and I have every penny in there. Analytics, you don't always get every penny. You don't always get every data source perfectly. There's, missing cookies. There's missing data from all sorts of reasons. There's cross-device data bleed. There's all sorts of problems with the data that makes its way into analytics. Now, you guys are obviously allowing folks to suck data in from various sources to create that sort of a unified view. But do people still sort of want that single source of truth and with truth in question marks?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to laugh at the part of the analogy that I'll go for first. I know people do treat finance like that, but look at customer case studies for like a big process mining company or ERP, and you have these behemoths of companies, Fortune 10s, Fortune 500s, who say, you're right, had I not used this ERP system, this process mining, I lost that $10 million in revenue. So meanwhile, we're trying to figure, you've got accountants auditing it to track the pennies. And there's decent sums of revenue that people just leave on the table because an automated reminder email didn't go out and they forgot to bill the client, or they billed the client 3 times and the client paid it multiple times because the client is a giant Fortune 100 company. So even at that end, analytics is still a bit of an art.
Right.
And that's where, I'll leave it to Wall Street to forecast those up and down. At the marketing level, exactly what you're saying is true. If finance has that on public companies, what is a mere marketing manager at a startup supposed to do? And this is where it gets into needing to get as much data as you can. Of course, garbage in, garbage out. So you have to set these systems up properly. That said, I think one of the things I've heard a lot is that like CRM is a product, not a project. And by that, it means, and I said CRM because that's how it was taught to me, but it could be your marketing automation system. It could be your EP. Everything is a constant ongoing evolution. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. You just have to figure out what good enough is, keep getting better, keep iterating, and do your best. Nothing's going to be perfect. If we search for perfect, if move fast, break things was the motto of Silicon Valley for a while. Don't necessarily break things like laws or whatnot, but you've got to figure out what is that good enough, because if you constantly try to get to 100% perfect, there's a lot of business you can do with 95.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, analytics is clearly directional to a great extent, right? And if you can, get a good sense of what's going on from the data you have, that's better than having no data at all in most cases, as long as the data is accurate. But
Mhm.
I wanted to get into sort of the people focus a lot on KPIs. So, like, what are my KPIs? But they sometimes forget to ask why, right? Like, why are these my KPIs? Because we find a lot, for example, under the did it hat, when I'm wearing that hat, a marketer will come to us and they'll, for example, say, oh, we want to optimize customer acquisition around CAC, right? And that's just what was passed down to them, right? But they're completely ignoring the fact that they have a power rule or an 80/20 rule in their customer value, where an average CAC is almost useless, but yet that's the KPI that they've been given. So I'd love to, I know it's a pet peeve of yours, the whole why. Like, why is the KPI, or why is the data? this. And I'd love to get your philosophy on delving into the why.
My first thought is always a business functions to support each other. The role of marketing is to help sales. The role of sales is to take what marketing does and ultimately, close the deal. Then the role of customer is to keep the customer happy, automatically renew it. The role of finance is to support the whole business in their endeavors. Engineering and product are focused on what sales and marketing are doing, refining it to better get the product into the hands for the marketing, sales, and customer folks. So within that picture, what is marketing's job? Marketing's job is to figure out, in this case, maybe it's customer acquisition cost, right? Go check with the CSMs. So if you're looking at what is that cost, who's renewing? If you're looking at those costs, like you've got to think of all of the different things that go into that measurement and how it changes over time. It's important to look at that single data point. You've got to get the whole story behind it. And that's oftentimes what I see for a lot of people is that you get these metrics from you're told by your CMO, gets told by their CEO, gets told by the board, we need this measurement on this. And you've got to give them as clear of a picture as you can. Here's the number. Here's the number broken down three ways. And maybe it's customer acquisition cost of the SMB, super small, but they churn. So actually that's a smaller cost, but we want to go after the mid-market. There's all of these asterisks, and you want to get as comprehensive a data set and understanding of the number before you pass it on to the next level up so that they can see that, they can make the more robust decision. And maybe it's something, customer acquisition cost and customer lifetime revenue, big things in the Valley these days as we try to get more towards, cash flow positive, which words I'd never have heard 5 years ago. And maybe that's the new trend. Maybe we'll have another 2021 bubble in a decade and then it'll burst again. But going back to the point, if you can understand that, paint the fuller picture, it allows you to help engage in the conversation with the executive leadership and say, this is what I think should happen.
So I'd love to delve a little deeper into the sort of difference between sort of a complex buying cycle or buying journey, for a company versus a more simplistic one. It's obviously easier to sort of, drive off of analytics if it's a very simple buying process, a single decision maker, a short sales cycle, whereas the more complex the decision is, the more data goes into truly understanding all the touch points. And that's where you tend to get data leakage. And people don't like to admit that there's data leakage and that they're missing some information. So I'd love to hear how you recommend that marketers sort of come to grips with that, right? Because, sure, if there was a single decision maker for every SaaS sale, then you wouldn't need ABM, right? But the reality is ABM is sort of, most people say, fairly thriving, or there's new versions of ABM coming out that are perhaps more or less sophisticated. But, companies in particular for big complex purchases, the sales cycle is quite complicated, and therefore there are analytics implications to that. And how should the marketer come to grips with that?
So first, I'll give an aside for folks thinking of complicated sales cycles. I know a fairly simple product. It's high four figures to low five figures for the price point. And their VP of sales actually forecasts out of Gong instead of Salesforce. Because to your point, on multi-step sales cycles, one of the key data points that they want is, when was the last time you talked to the customer?
Right.
Show me this number in Salesforce, but are you single-threaded or multi-threaded? Have you talked to them in the past quarter or month or day? So that's some ways from the sales side that you try to approach it. And I'm using that because sales is, did I talk with them or not? Did I send this? Marketing has this whole other level of data too. It's not just who did we interact with in this immediate buying process. It's also who's the person on that team that we met at a conference 5 years back. And then they showed up at our booth year after year at the same conference. It's also, we're engaging in the sales cycle. Got the ongoing sales cycle. Are there folks that we should be adding to the CRM and then pushing them their content? So as this conversation is going on in that company, well, now they're getting webinars. So they hear about product A on the side in conversations, and then they get a webinar about product A and how product A can help fit their use case. So there's so much data that marketing can get. And part of it is figuring out what from past buying cycles has been useful Is it useful to do something at the low end, a webinar, a white paper, an ad retargeting on LinkedIn? At the high end, to a custom dinner where you fly people out and have them keynote at a conference. There's so many different levers that you can pull, and it's figuring out which one of those are the right ones to pull for your particular sales cycle and to support that type of sales cycle. Obviously, it gets confused. If you have these really long, complex sales cycles, the adage tends to be the more money you spend, the more you want to see somebody in person. There's never a limit where you're spending it. I guess there is a lower limit if you're spending enough where you're like, I don't want to see this in person. Like, I don't, I just want to do PLG. I want to buy my subscription online or whatnot. But it still helps to see those folks in conferences. So when you're thinking of going to buy it, that's the company that comes to mind. So I don't, I'd argue the sales cycle is more complex for a marketer to support, but the complexity of marketing is not, of the overall marketing operation, is not purely dependent on the sales cycle. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. But a lot of those players that you're describing, right? They need to be sort of in data compliance, right? Because you can only really make a decision based on how influential those touch points were if you kept track of them, right? And so to your point about some folks saying, well, I get more robust information or more predictive information out of Gong than I do out of Salesforce or whatever, if the person's on HubSpot, for example. And, marketing may be out of compliance and not, tagging things with UTM parameters and adding all that information into their robust data set. And then it may be sales that's out of compliance where the salespeople are not, noting every dinner or noting every call or noting the SMS conversation that they had, right? And of course, if you don't have it in the data set, you can't make a decision based on it. So have you had to go in and sort of educate your clients and others at conferences like, hey, get all this data in so that we can advise you better? Because if we don't have the data, we can't advise you.
I don't know any ops person who hasn't lost at least a couple of hairs because somebody in their business isn't compliant. And I don't know a single sales rep who likes updating things. So it does happen. I think there's new tools, whether it's call recorders, auto updating, CRMs, or whatnot, that are helping collect more data. There will be an assumption that this means people will be more compliant. More data does not always mean more compliant. So I'll be interested to watch those trends. It's great if something auto updates. It's terrible if the rep doesn't take a quick look and say, yeah, the conversation went great, and then it maybe went terribly. Or, sentiment analysis. I know a security company where negative sentiment is great for them. It's the reverse of most other things. They're like, yeah, people FUD sell security. Um, So you've always got to watch for those things, and I'll be curious how it goes as we continue to automate more. A decade ago, a call recorder would have been viewed as very suspicious. Very few people would have them on calls. We had for those remembering back in the day for video calls, it was weird. You had to like be perfect. You kind of wanted a business suit on. The bar has lowered. In 2019, it was still pretty formal. By 2025, we're like, I've done a dozen Zoom calls a day. I don't need to do certain things. And we're all used to those call recorders. We're no longer like, this is suspicious. Somebody's recording every word. Sometimes there's more call recorders than there are people. I worry people will assume that more data means better data, and
Mm.
that I would caution against. And as we continue to have more types of data, whether a decade ago, I would have never said every single call everybody's going to be on will be recorded, and we'll be sad if it's not. I don't know what I'll say in a decade in the future of if I don't have, will I be assume all of my texts are uploaded in the cloud into a particular database where I can see all of that? But I know some people already do that. Maybe that will be default. So we'll continue to get more there. We've got computer vision now that can analyze who's at your booth and track which people came by your booth but didn't scan in. So there's a lot of types of technology, but what does that really mean? Were they looking at your booth because they were looking at your booth, or they were looking, being like, all right, because I'll shamelessly out myself here. Like, is that a Butterfingers or Reese's peanut butter cup? Like, kind of looking for a snack here at a booth. I might not know the company name. I might be looking at like what free handout they have. some of that data will be slightly biased by somebody's chocolate preference, perhaps, or whatnot. So I guess in there, I've set a couple different examples of we're getting more data. The importance will be understanding what it's saying, and understanding what data should be used and what data shouldn't be used.
For sure. One thing I've noticed, I've got a bunch of B2B clients. Some of them are in old school B2B, and some of them are more sort of SaaS level B2B. But one thing they have in common is they tend to have some kind of a power curve within their customer set, right? And so as they move towards profit maximization, it's going to be more and more important that they understand not just what does their power customer look like, the ones that have high revenue per month or per year and are very sticky and potentially are more susceptible to upsell, cross-sell. All those things are sort of LTV predictors. But understanding those LTV predictors and how far towards the top of the funnel you can put those, right? To know ahead of time when you're crafting your marketing strategy, does something really predict? Does a combination of their SIC code and company head count and whatever, how predictive are all those things to LTV can have huge implications to a marketing strategy. So, how do you advise folks to tackle that element of it as folks are moving more into this cash flow and EBITDA mindset if they haven't already been there?
It depends. This is more of a later stage question because I sell to people who are later stage to larger enterprises. I'm an early stage founder, so I have people that ask me about their marketing strategy and don't have a product. So we've got the question is more applicable for one of those two audiences.
Yeah.
So first, I'd say get as much data as you can and know what's relevant. So I've helped people set up Google Analytics and they ask me what to track, like what matters for your product. Okay, good question. I'm like, okay, well, you've got this type of product, and then they'll start selecting each of those boxes. And I'm like, do you really care which version of iOS somebody is on? Is that what will that change about your behavior? Some companies, yes, maybe you're a video game company it doesn't work on, or an app or something. E-commerce company, probably not much. I am going to buy a mouse and have the same, most likely, affinity to purchase an external mouse for my laptop if I am an iOS user or Android, let alone which of the various versions of iOS I have and how quickly I update and whatnot. So know what's most likely to be relevant. And I include those data because the number of times people have added too much data and they're like, I can't sift through this. I'm like, well, you do a first gut check on what makes sense, and then make sure that certain other things that you might not know about you're tracking. If it's B2B or types of like always get the industry, the size, location, company headquarters, whatnot. For B2C, as many demographic types as that you can get, not necessarily down to, okay, does this, I don't know what ridiculous there's probably a lot of information you can get on B2C. We all have read certain case studies. But what's relevant to you? Because it costs to get that information. It costs to enrich that data. So figure out what's most targeted and what's most applicable for your business. And then do a lot of cohort analysis. Like break it down. How does it change? Is this true by, we've got this many leads. Is that true for across industries? We get more at this marketing conference last year? Equal number of leads this year and last year. Last year they were terrible. This year they're great. How are those leads going through the cycle? Are they leading to deals? Are they leads based on active deals or are they net new? All of these types of things, like the basic stuff you got to track and then add on some other things that maybe you think of, maybe you wouldn't.
That's great advice. You mentioned data enrichment, right? And data enrichment's a hot topic, and it's sort of a similar question you have to ask yourself. Just because you can add this piece of data to your data file, does that mean that you should? But of course, sometimes these third-party data sources can actually add a pretty relevant piece of data to the data file. So how should people think through the data augmentation, data enrichment side of things, where they probably didn't get that as first party information that they asked in a lead form, but later on they were like, I'm going to score this lead so that I can decide what to do with it. Do I just put it in my drip campaign or do I pass it over to a sales team? So I'm going to pull in information from third parties. How does that fit into your philosophy or maybe the Scoop philosophy more broadly?
So, in terms of what I think through first what type data enrichment always has a cost to it too. So, which are the things that you're trying to enrich? Not just what are you trying to enrich them with, but also who are you trying to enrich? Are these high value prospects that you got from a website type capture form? Are these website de-anonymization type people who may have come to your website, maybe not? If they are website de-anonymization, we've tried a number of different types of tools at Scoop, and I've explored a number. Some are great. There's one vendor who tried to tell me that our ICP was like nurses, which in case anybody missed this, we're a business intelligence tool. Nurses are fantastic. I was an EMT for a couple of years. They are not the primary buyers of business intelligence software. So I knew something was wrong there. Um, so understand kind of what the quality of what you're getting, and then also what's the purpose of retargeting? What types of information do you need? Are you using this information to enrich it with a phone number, but will you ever call them? I know so many companies who are paying for phone numbers, and I don't, many of them have not made a single phone call, and they are 4 years old.
Right, right. That's interesting. I happen to have a product I'm about to release, which is phone-based, just because I looked at my contact databases and realized it's one of the few ways I can probably break through the clutter. So I have an AI-based voicemail platform releasing on Monday, which will be a lot of fun. It's been in internal beta for a while, or closed beta for a while. But speaking of AI is one topic that sort of runs through analytics, it runs through marketing, it runs through sales. So what should we be talking about that we haven't covered yet as it relates to the intersection of analytics and AI?
Question that we haven't really talked about is how you tell the story about it. So there's two parts. One, and this tends to follow a career progression. So you start out, you're some type of analyst, you're just getting the data, whatever people tells you. Maybe you'll have an insight, maybe you won't. Then you get promoted, you start to think, okay, let me do dashboard creation or whatnot. Obviously, everybody follows a generally different path. But then at some point, you're the person presenting the numbers. And at that point, it's not just the number, because if you're going to your board, whether it's public or private or VCs or whatnot, they don't just care about here's the sales number. They care about how is this changing? Is it going up or down? Why? So as you continue to people evolve through their career, one of the constant questions you should be asking is why? Why is this number this way? What other data would I want? How would I present this? What do I think the company should be doing? And then test that, see what data that you have, and continue to ask those questions of yourself. And if you can get answers to those, that's the type of executive level thinking that people start to look for. Not just website traffic is up year over year by X%. Is that because we added in, a new widget to the website where, say, for password companies, I know 2 websites I visit all the time for random password generators. I will always think of those companies, and it doesn't matter who develops it, but like that's in my head of those 2 companies. Is it that, or is it here's this template library we have, here's this blog post on metrics VCs care about for the next fundraise, here's this comp plan. Is it that type of content, or is it just you start paying a lot more for Google Ads? Is it you have a billboard? So figuring out that why and helping inform what you plan for in the next phase.
So what about a middle to maybe middle to senior manager who realizes that the why hasn't been asked? So they want to essentially be the hero, right? And start asking the why themselves, even though they may not be the final person presenting the deck. So they want to almost change the trajectory. They want to maybe change the KPIs. They want to have a greater focus of the organization on EBITDA generating versus non-EBITDA generating marketing or sales activities. So, but they may be in a political environment where it's sort of difficult for them, right? They don't want to overshadow their boss, right? They want to be the hero, but not in a competitive way. Any recommendations for folks who sort of probably are right at that cusp where they're going to move to the next level in their career? They want to use the why as part of that catalyst, but do it in a diplomatic way.
So I have read, and I think we all have either read and or experienced many forms of politics throughout all of our careers. And I'll assume good intent here on all parties involved, because if I'm going to start out assuming bad intent, there's many flavors of that, and that's harder to react to because you need to know which flavor it is. So the assumption of good intent, one way might be, all right, senior level manager reporting to VP, reporting to CMO. Senior level manager email, here's the three things you asked for. I also noticed, here manager, whether it's a Slack, a phone call, whatever your flow of conversation is, I also noticed this other thing. If it's appropriate, dig into it a little bit more and say, here's a couple other things I noticed, and I think we should engage in a conversation with skip level manager about it for these reasons. Know what your managers, depend. Sometimes if you engage in skip level management, that's great, and you have a cadence for that. Sometimes you don't. So know how it works best within your flow. And hopefully, you know your manager well enough to know what she or he will react very positively to. Um, but that's usually the best is if you go out, present it, say, maybe you present it and say, I'd like to do this and investigate this a little further for X, Y, and Z reasons. Always have a reason, because if you don't know the reason, how is anybody else going to know the reason? And then just communicate in whatever form is natural. I think there's many things where 2 decades ago, people would say you need to schedule an in-person meeting. It could be a text. In another decade, it could be sending your boss a funny emoji. We're going back to hieroglyphics in some ways. Whatever method of communication works best of, hey, saw this, numbers are, I don't know, some big lightning bolt type thing. Again, defer to your boss and what they're like. Please do not use a lightning bolt in my recommendation. Um, but go back, say the reasons, engage in a meeting because you want to be in that meeting if at all possible, because you want to be the person presenting the number, and you should be. You are the most informed. You came up with the hypothesis, you dug into the data behind it. Your boss doesn't want to have to do these things. They want you to take problems off their plate, not say, I know they asked for 3 metrics, but we should really do 5, and I think you need to do more work.
So actually, that brings me back to this area of potentially missing metrics, right? So if a competitor, or if there's some competitive information that indicates, for example, that some data that comes from an event or some data that comes from somewhere that is not currently in the company data set needs to be added or would be influential or we'd be able to come up with better analytics, but it's not in there now. I would imagine those kinds of things are going to face a little bit more resistance, right? Because it's something they're not doing now. Oh, we don't always enter in all the business cards we get from the trade show, or we don't always enter in the folks who download this white paper, or we don't know. So if something's missing and somebody in analytics is sort of like, I was chatting with a bunch of other folks at a conference and everyone else is tracking X, but that's not currently something we're tracking. How should they present that if there are costs involved, right? Should they do an analysis of the pros and cons of that?
Try to figure out kind of an estimate of how much friction it will cause. So business cards at a conference, is there just an app that can do that for you very quickly? Great. Have a summer intern go enter. You've got a stack of business cards 10 feet high. Sometimes people don't know what to do with interns the first day. I mean, I've been a summer intern. I'd do that. So to be clear, I'm not saying anything I wouldn't do myself. So first figure out that friction and if it's worth it or not. I think of our own onboarding process at Scoop, and we think through each step. Where are we having people fill it out? What checkbox? Every additional point of friction you add makes it less likely that somebody will onboard. That means a lot at the PLG stage. It means a lot less if you're selling a $200,000 product. Somebody has to check an extra box for a $200,000 product. They're going to do it. They're not even going to notice it. So think through that. They will notice if it's for an onboarding for a white paper. I realize that point that I just made could be misconstrued. So it's part of the sales process, a box check. As part of a let me download a white paper to see if I'm interested, a box check harder.
Right, right.
So thinking of friction, and then what's the value add? Is it worth that level of friction?
And what about hard costs? Because there's friction, right? The potential buyer might be heading into, to add that piece of data to their data set, their own record. But then there's also potential costs that the enterprise has to absorb beyond the intern scanning business cards, for example. But something more onerous. You think the same cost benefit analysis would be what should be presented by whomever identified the missing data?
Look at that too. You have to keep in mind for those, say it's a new field in your CRM that you need to add. Who has to add that field? How often will it be filled out? What's the ultimate value of adding that field?
Right, right. Okay, anything else that we should have covered today as it relates to the ever-evolving world of data and analytics?
I think the question to keep thinking about is, and that I get a lot of, is how will AI impact it? A large language models and hallucination, not great with numbers yet. I think we've all in the past years at some point had an experience trying to get ChatGPT. One that comes to mind is count orange strawberries. That made a lot of podcasts for that example. It will continue to get influenced though, and AI will be used through more and more things. So continue to know where your data is coming from, because it's one thing if you're feeding into a model and saying, here's a call transcript, create me a blog post on it. It's a very, very different thing if you're feeding a model a spreadsheet and saying, here's the numbers I get, what should I be forecasting? You still really need to know each of those numbers and each of where each of them came through in a way that is just less applicable for remembering each quote. So I'd caution people on over reliance on AI for numbers.
Great advice. It's getting better, but it's still, you don't want numbers hallucinations. Those could be pretty scary.
Mhm.
Thanks so much for joining me and sharing your wisdom with the viewers and listeners of the EMA podcast.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's been great to be on today.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.